In my family, you were either an asset or you were exiled. I'm Scarlett Edwards, and for 29 years I tried to be the good daughter. I built a life helping my small Oregon town, while my family, the local timber dynasty, mocked my work. But I held the one thing they couldn't control: 500 acres of sacred untouched forest my grandfather left to me. It was my one piece of leverage, my one connection to his memory. Then came the late-night text from my sister-in-law, 6 words that would light a match to my entire world. Scarlett, do not text. Call me now. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The end meeting button clicked, and the face of the federal grants administrator dissolved from my screen. I let out a breath I'd been holding for 6 months. We're thrilled to partner with Rosewood Ms. Edwards. Your proposal was airtight. I leaned back in my chair, the old springs groaning, and stared through the plate glass window of my office. My name, Rosewood Revitalization, was painted on the glass in neat gold leaf. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted across Main Street, illuminating the peeling paint on the historic theater marquee 2 blocks down. The grant was approved. The theater would be saved. A quiet, deep thrum of satisfaction settled in my chest. This was my work, not just my job, my work. I was in my own way rebuilding my hometown, one grant, one project, one restored brick at a time. My office, a converted Depression-era hardware store, smelled like old wood and new paper. It was my sanctuary, the one place in this town that was entirely mine. In Rosewood, Oregon, you were either an Edwards or you worked for one. The Edwards Timber and Mill sign on the highway was the first thing you saw coming in and the last thing you saw leaving. The mill was the town's heart, and my family was its pacemaker. My father, Arthur Edwards, was the kind of man who measured the world in board feet and tonnage. He was a patriarch, ripped from an older, harder century, a man who believed in God, hard work, and the absolute authority of his own voice. My older brother Liam was the heir. He had our father's ambition, but none of his discipline, coasting on a river of charm and second chances. Liam was the golden boy destined to take the mill and the family name into the next generation. And my mother Eleanor was the family's polished, anxious diplomat. Her entire life was a performance of family unity, a tense, fragile peace she maintained at any cost, usually mine. Then there was me, Scarlett, the grant writer, the community consultant, the one who had left for college and come back with a degree in something my father found useless. "It's a charity hobby, Scarlett," he'd boomed at Sunday dinner just last week, gesturing with his fork. "The mill makes the money. You just help spend it on paint." I'd smiled the way I always did and said nothing. There was no point. In his eyes, I was a decorative accessory to the Edwards legacy, not a part of its engine. He was wrong. I was the one who owned the fuel. My grandfather, the one Edwards who had seen the world in color instead of timber gray, had understood me. He'd spent his last years teaching me the land, not how to cut it down, but how to read it. When he died, he'd bypassed his son entirely. He left me his heart, 500 pristine acres of old-growth forest known as Bitterroot Creek. It was a sacred, silent place, a cathedral of fir and cedar that bordered the mill's primary harvest lands. It was also, as my father had furiously pointed out, the single most valuable parcel of untouched timber in the county. But it was mine. And my contract with the mill, the one I'd drafted myself, was ironclad. They could lease it from me for a token $1 a year. In exchange, they were permitted sustainable thinning only. No clear cuts, no trees over a certain diameter. Everything monitored, everything reported. It was the one piece of leverage I had, the one string I could pull to keep them tethered to some semblance of stewardship. It was the one part of my grandfather's legacy I could protect. Which is why I was in my office at 9 p.m., long after the streetlights had flickered on, staring at my quarterly tax prep. The mill's harvest reports were a necessary part of my income filing, even for $1. Usually, they were meticulous. This quarter's report, which had arrived yesterday, was different. It was vague. The harvest totals were lumped together, the plot maps blurry and indistinct. It was sloppy. Probably just Liam being lazy. I opened my email. I was used to managing my brother to cleaning up his small messes before they became my father's problems. I typed a new message addressing it to Liam and, as a courtesy, his new wife, Chloe. Chloe had recently taken over as the mill's accountant, a move that had surprised everyone. She was sharp, maybe too sharp for Liam. "Hi Liam and Chloe," I wrote. "Working on my quarterly taxes and the Bitterroot harvest report is a little vague. Could you send me the detailed manifest and the GPS plot points for the Q3 thinning? Just need to square my books for the IRS. Thanks a bunch, Scarlett." It was polite, routine. A simple pinprick of administrative housekeeping. I hit send, shut down my computer, and locked the office. Walking to my car, I felt the familiar ache that always came after dealing with my family. That low-level exhaustion of being the outsider, the responsible one, the one who was still, after all these years, just trying to earn her place at a table I wasn't sure I even wanted. I was tethered to them by blood, by love, by guilt, and by 500 acres of trees. I drove home, made tea, and tried to shake the feeling. I was almost asleep, the clock on my nightstand glowing 11:47 p.m. When my phone lit up on the table, it wasn't a call. It was a text from a number I recognized as Chloe's personal cell. My blood went cold. It was 6 words. "Scarlett, do not text, call me, now." My thumb hovered over the call button. A text like that at this hour wasn't a request. It was a siren. I hit the button. Chloe picked up before the first ring finished, her voice a choked, wet whisper. "Scarlett, are you alone?" "Yes, Chloe, what's wrong?" I was already out of bed, pulling jeans on over my sleep shorts. "I can't," she sobbed, a raw, terrified sound. "He'll know. He checks everything. Meet me, please. The old logging road, the first pull-off past the creek bridge. 10 minutes. Come alone. Don't. God, Scarlett, just come." The line clicked dead. My heart hammered against my ribs, a cold dread coiling in my stomach. The old logging road. That was mill property, dark and deserted. 10 minutes. I grabbed my keys, shoved my bare feet into hiking boots, and didn't bother with a coat. My truck's headlights cut through the pitch-black Oregon night. The paved road gave way to gravel, the tires crunching loud in the silence. I crossed the narrow concrete bridge over Bitterroot Creek, the water a black mirror below, and pulled into the turnout. Her car, a small sedan, was tucked into the shadows. I killed my engine. The sudden silence of the forest was absolute. A second later, my passenger door was yanked open. It was Chloe, but not the Chloe I knew. Not the sharp, composed woman from the mill's office. This woman was a wreck, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes wide and wild in the dim glow of my dashboard lights. "Turn off your lights," she hissed, scrambling in and slamming the door. I clicked them off, plunging us into near total darkness. I could hear her breathing fast and shallow, like a cornered animal. "Chloe, what is going on? You're scaring me." "He's going to ruin us all," she whispered, her hands fumbling with the zipper of her jacket. "He's going to ruin the mill, the town, everything." "Who, Liam?" She flinched at his name. "Here." She shoved a small cold object into my hand, a USB drive. I found it. I've been seeing things for months, numbers that didn't add up. Accounts I didn't recognize. He told me it was creative accounting, just moving money around to keep your father happy about profits. Her voice broke. But it wasn't. It's gambling, Scarlett. Massive gambling debts. Thousands a week. He owes so much money. To people, not the kind of people you get a loan from. My blood felt thick and slow. What did he do? "The woods," she choked out, gesturing vaguely toward the dark wall of trees around us. "Your woods, Bitterroot Creek." I gripped the USB drive so tightly the metal edge cut into my palm. "What about my woods?" "He's not thinning, Scarlett. She said, the words spilling out in a desperate torrent. He's been clear-cutting for a year, a shadow crew off the books. They come in at night. He's been forging the harvest permits using the mill's letterhead and selling the old-growth timber, selling it to an international buyer, black market, for cash. It felt like the air had been punched from my lungs. I couldn't breathe, couldn't process. He's been cooking the books to hide the income, but the bank's compliance department, they're starting to ask questions. They called me yesterday. That's why I looked. He has a separate ledger. It's all on there. He's going to prison, Scarlett, and he's going to take the whole company down with him. A wave of sickness, hot and sharp, rose in my throat. This wasn't just about money. It wasn't just theft. It was a desecration. My grandfather's face flashed in my mind. His rough hands, the way he'd taught me to identify the bark of a ponderosa pine. He had trusted me. He had trusted me to protect this one last piece of wilderness. And my brother had sold it for gambling chips. The sorrow was brief, burned away by a sudden glacial rage. "Go to your sister's," I said, my voice terrifyingly calm. "The one in Portland. Go there right now." Chloe looked at me, her eyes wide. "What?" "Go, now, tonight. Pack a bag, tell no one, and leave your car at the bus station. Take a ride share from there. Don't tell Liam where you are. Don't answer his calls. I'll handle this. I'll protect you, I promise. But you need to disappear." My professional brain, the part of me that wrote proposals and managed crises, had taken over. She nodded, tears streaming, and fumbled for the door handle. "He'll kill me if he knows I told you." "He won't know," I said. "Go!" She scrambled out of the truck and was gone. I sat alone in the darkness for a full minute, the USB drive heavy in my hand. Then I started my truck, turned around, and drove back toward the highway. But I didn't go home. I drove to the fire access road 3 miles south, a gate I had the key to. I parked my truck deep in the shadows and grabbed the high-powered flashlight from my glove box. The pre-dawn air was cold, smelling of damp earth and cedar. I knew these woods better than I knew my own office. I walked fast, not on the trail, but through the underbrush, my boots making almost no sound. I followed the ridgeline, my grandfather's old route. The rage was a motor pushing me forward. The sky was just beginning to pale from black to a deep, bruised purple when I reached the crest of the ridge overlooking the north parcel. I stopped. The flashlight beam cut through the mist, and my breath was stolen. It wasn't a forest, it was a graveyard. A gaping, muddy wound in the earth. Hundreds of ancient trees were gone. Stumps, massive and pale, stuck out of the ravaged soil like broken teeth. Deep ruts from heavy machinery had churned the delicate forest floor into a swamp. They hadn't just cut, they had annihilated. It was a ghost cut, a void, a scar so vast and brutal my mind couldn't take it all in. This was the cathedral my grandfather had loved. This was the legacy he had left me. I sank to my knees, the wet mud soaking through my jeans. The betrayal was a physical sickness, a sour, metallic taste in my mouth. I lifted my phone, my hands shaking so violently I could barely open the camera app. I had to document it. I had to record the scale of this violation. I hit record, panning the phone's light across the devastation, the silence absolute, except for my own ragged breathing. Then I froze. A branch cracked. Close. Down in the cut near where the logging road must be. I dropped my hand, plunging the scene back into darkness. My heart stopped. I listened, every nerve ending screaming, a low murmur of voices. Then one clearer, a man's voice, rough and unfamiliar, drifting up through the naked trees. "Boss said to check the perimeter one more time. Make sure no hikers saw the trucks last night." Another voice grunted in reply. I wasn't alone. I didn't breathe until my truck was back on the highway, the sun just a faint rumor in the east. My hands were caked with mud. I drove past my apartment, past the diner starting its morning prep, and went straight to my office. I triple-locked the door, drew the blinds, and sat in the blue light of my monitor. My hands were shaking again, but not from fear. It was rage. I jammed the USB drive Chloe had given me into the port. It wasn't just a ledger. It was a mirror world of the mill's entire operation: falsified shipping manifests, emails from an anonymous server discussing old-growth tonnage and port logistics, scanned copies of forged state environmental permits, and then the bank records. A web of offshore accounts transfers moving in 5- and 6-figure chunks. Liam hadn't just stolen from me, he was laundering the black market cash through the mill's primary operating accounts. He was using Edwards Timber and Mill as a front to wash millions of dollars in illegal timber sales. This wasn't just theft. This was federal. This was wire fraud, mail fraud, tax evasion, and given the international buyer, probably racketeering. He hadn't just put himself in jeopardy. He'd put the entire company, our father's legacy, our grandfather's name, and the jobs of half of Rosewood on the line for a poker debt. My first instinct was to call the police. The state police. But the image of the mill's gates chained by federal marshals stopped me. The whole town would collapse overnight. I had to give them one chance. One chance to fix it themselves. My fingers, numb and cold, dialed my father's number. "There's an emergency," I said, my voice flat. "A financial one. Call Liam and Mom, and I'll be at the lodge in 20 minutes. I didn't wait for a reply. I grabbed the USB, got in my truck, and drove to the stone and timber fortress my family called home. They were already there, gathered around the massive oak table in the great room, a fire roaring in the hearth. My father, Arthur, sat at the head, his face a mask of impatience. Liam slouched in his chair, looking hungover and annoyed. My mother, Eleanor, stood by the fireplace, wringing her hands, her face etched with anxiety. "This had better be important, Scarlett," Arthur barked. "I have a mill to run." I walked to the table. I didn't sit. I placed the small USB drive on the polished wood. It looked tiny, insignificant. "You don't have a mill, Dad," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the high-ceilinged room. "You have a front for a criminal enterprise." The color drained from my mother's face. Liam sat up straight, his eyes narrowing. I explained it all: the ghost cut, the shadow crew, the gambling, the offshore accounts, the forged permits, the federal risk. I laid it out piece by piece. "We have one option," I finished, my voice shaking but firm. "We go to the authorities now. We report Liam, we firewall the company, we cooperate fully. It's the only way to save the mill. It's the only way to save the jobs." There was a terrible, ringing silence. I looked at my father. He wasn't looking at the USB drive. He was looking at his son. "Liam," Arthur's voice was low, dangerous. "Son." And then the performance. Liam, cornered, became a master. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Wow," he breathed, shaking his head. "Just wow." He stood up, running a hand through his perfect hair. "This is insane. Dad, this is Chloe." He spat the name. "She's been cooking the books for months. I caught her. She's probably having an affair, trying to set me up, steal money. And Scarlett?" He turned his gaze on me, his eyes filled with a manufactured pity. "She's always been jealous. She hates that you're trusting me with the mill. She's twisting this, using Chloe's mess to try and get control. She wants to turn your company into one of her hippy-dippy nature preserves." I couldn't speak. The audacity of the lie, the completeness of it, stole my breath. I turned my last hope to my mother. "Mom," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "Mom, you know me. You know I would never. You know he's—" Eleanor's face was pale, her eyes darting between her husband, her son, and me. I saw the calculation. I saw the desperate, lifelong need for family unity. She took a breath. She stood up straight. She walked not to me, not to the evidence, but right past me. She put a trembling hand on Liam's shoulder. Her voice, when it came, was ice. "Scarlett, how could you—" she whispered as if I'd stabbed her. How could you come in here waving this filth, trying to destroy your brother after all he's done for this family? You are bringing this poison into our home." "Poison!" I shrieked, the word tearing out of me. "He is the poison. He's a criminal. It's all on the drive." "I won't look at your lies," Arthur roared, slamming his fist on the table, his face purple. "You dare come into my home and accuse your brother, accuse me. I'm trying to save you. You're trying to ruin us," Liam shouted, pointing a finger at me. "You've always wanted. This always been the jealous little bitch in the background. Enough." Arthur's voice cracked like a rifle shot. He stood, his shadow covering me. "You are no daughter of mine. You've made your choice. You stand against this family. Get out." He didn't say it. He roared it. "Get out of my house, now!" I looked at them, the three of them a united front of lies and denial, my father rigid with pride, my brother smirking with victory, my mother clinging to his arm, her eyes cold. I said nothing. I turned, walked out of the great room, and shut the heavy oak door behind me. I was numb. I drove back to my office, the sun now high and bright, making the town look cheerful, normal. It was a lie. I sat in my chair, staring at the blank screen for hours. The numbness receded, leaving a vast, hollow ache. The community I'd been fighting for was built on a lie I was now exiled from. Just after dark, my phone lit up on the desk. A text message. From my mother. "We have made our choice. You are no longer in Edwards. Don't contact us again. The will is being changed. We're done." I read the words. Once. Twice. The hollow ache was gone. The sorrow was gone. It was all burned away in a flash, replaced by something cold, hard, and perfectly clear. It was the click of a lock snapping into place. They had made their choice. Now, I would make mine. My fingers moved over the screen. I typed 2 words back. Got it. The morning after the got it text, the silence from my family was absolute. But the town wasn't silent for long. The machine my father controlled had been activated. My regular order at the Main Street coffee shop, the one I'd helped secure a small business grant for, was lost by a barista who wouldn't meet my eyes. People I'd known since kindergarten. People I'd served on town committees with suddenly crossed the street to avoid me, their faces averted. The rumor mill, fueled by Liam's lies and my father's authority, was running at full capacity. Scarlett, the ungrateful daughter. Scarlett, the liar. Scarlett, the greedy, jealous sister trying to extort the family and destroy the town's biggest employer. The escalation was as swift as it was brutal. On Tuesday, my office window was egged. On Wednesday, someone used a key to scratch "Traitor" into the paint of my truck door. I came out on Thursday morning, a cup of coffee in my hand, to find all 4 of my tires slashed, the rubber gaping open in the cold morning air. This was no longer a family dispute. This was a public execution. My father and Liam had declared war, and they'd enlisted the entire community as their army. I stood on the sidewalk, looking at the flat tires, the cold air biting at my cheeks. And I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel the hollow ache of the night before. I felt a profound, clarifying calm. They had all made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. All my life, my family had mistaken my kindness for weakness. My father, a man of brute force and heavy machinery, saw my work, my data, my proposals, my community outreach as soft, a cute hobby. My brother saw my compliance as a safety net he could jump on without consequence. They thought my weapons were polite emails and hurt feelings. They had forgotten what I actually do. I don't chop down trees. I am a strategist. I am an architect of systems. I deal in legal compliance, in data analysis, in proposals that move millions of dollars. My father's power came from a 5-ton logging truck and a loud voice. Mine came from a perfectly worded, legally binding 50-page document. And I was about to write my masterpiece. I didn't call the local tow truck. I called my insurance, got my tires replaced, paid in cash, and drove 2 hours north to Portland. I didn't walk into the oak-paneled office of a family lawyer who knew my father. I walked into the glass and steel high-rise office of Anya Sharma, the most feared environmental litigator in the state. She was a shark in a $1,000 suit with eyes that missed nothing. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I sat across from her, plugged the USB drive into her laptop, and said, "This is a breach of contract, a violation of state environmental protection laws, and financial fraud." She watched the data spool out her face impassive. She spent 10 minutes clicking through the offshore bank records and the forged permits. Then she looked up, a thin, predatory smile touching her lips. Edwards, she said, "the breach of contract is just the appetizer. The triple damages for the black market timber theft and the civil fraud, that's the main course. We're not just filing a suit. We're filing for an immediate injunction and a prejudgment lien on all mill assets." I drove back to Rosewood that night, my truck handling stiffly on the new tires. I didn't go home. I went to my office, locked the door, and got to work. First, the financial attack. This was my soft skill in action. I meticulously copied the USB drive's contents, organizing the data into an irrefutable file that was impossible to misinterpret. Exhibit A, forged permits. Exhibit B, offshore wire transfers. Exhibit C, black market buyer communications. I didn't walk this file into the local Rosewood Bank branch where the manager, Mr. Henderson, played golf with my father every Saturday. That would be my father's move. Mine was different. I drafted a formal cover letter citing specific federal statutes, the Bank Secrecy Act, anti-money laundering, AML regulations, and the Patriot Act's Know Your Customer rules. I attached the complete digital file. I sent one copy via encrypted email and a hard copy via certified mail return receipt requested to the Chief Compliance Officer at the bank's corporate headquarters in San Francisco. I sent a second identical package to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, the branch of the U.S. Treasury, that deals with exactly this kind of large-scale financial malfeasance. I knew that Chief Compliance Officer and federal regulators were the only two things a corporate bank feared more than God. They wouldn't call my father. They would act to protect themselves immediately and without mercy. Then the masterstroke. The part that wasn't just about revenge but about justice. This was my real work. I sat at my desk for the next 72 hours, fueled by nothing but black coffee and a cold, controlled fury. I used the very skills my father had mocked to draft the most important proposal of my life. I contacted the Oregon Land Trust. I contacted a federal economic revitalization fund I'd worked with before. My proposal was titled the Rosewood Economic and Environmental Trust. The plan was simple, brutal in its logic, and constructive in its outcome. My civil suit seeking tens of millions in damages would in all likelihood bankrupt the mill. The court would award me the damages which I would collect by seizing the mill's remaining assets, its land, its equipment, its buildings. The trust, I was simultaneously forming a nonprofit entity, would then acquire these assets from me. Edwards Timber and Mill. The company would be dissolved. Its assets would be strategically sold. The profits would be used to fund two primary objectives. First, the complete environmental remediation and permanent protection of the 500 acres of Bitterroot Creek, turning the scarred land into a public park and interpretive center. Second, a retraining fund and small business incubator capitalized with millions of dollars for every single mill worker who Liam and my father's pride had betrayed. I wasn't just tearing down their legacy, I was using my charity hobby skills to build a better one from the parts. I filed the suit, I sent the packages, and I waited. The response wasn't a slow burn, it was a detonation. It came 3 days later. The federal government, as it turns out, does not like it when you use a federally insured bank to launder millions of dollars in illegal foreign money. The bank's corporate headquarters, facing massive federal penalties and the potential loss of their charter, acted instantly to prove their own compliance. My phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered. "Scarlett." It was Chloe, her voice a terrified whisper. She was still in hiding. They know. Oh God, Scarlett, they know. The bank, they froze everything. The operating accounts, the payroll, Liam's personal accounts, everything. That evening, as the sun went down, I drove past the entrance to the mill. The usual plume of smoke from the burners was gone. The night shift floodlights were dark. The massive parking lot was empty. A new heavy chain-link gate, the kind used for repossessions, had been padlocked across the entrance. A large laminated sign had been zip-tied to it, the text stark under my headlights. Mill closed pending corporate audit. The silence was heavier and more final than any engine. The first shot had been fired, and it was a killing blow. The town didn't know it yet, but the Edwards dynasty had just flatlined. The explosion was coming. The pending audit sign on the mill gate was a spark in a dry forest. By Friday, the forest was burning. The bank freeze meant payroll hadn't just bounced. It had vanished. The entire town's direct deposits had failed. Panic, raw and ugly, hit Rosewood like a flash flood. The supermarket was jammed, people trying to buy groceries before their debit cards were declined. The line at the tiny local credit union snaked out the door and around the block. It was chaos. And my father, cornered, and desperate, did what he always did. He went on the attack. Flyers appeared printed on mill letterhead. Emergency community meeting. High school gymnasium, 7 p.m. Come and hear the truth about the attack on our town. An attack, not a consequence. An attack. He was framing his public execution of me as an act of community defense. I spent the day on the phone with my lawyer, Anya. This is it, I told her. He's putting me on trial. Good. Anya's voice was sharp. Don't go in there with a speech. Go in there with a spreadsheet. And Scarlett, I've made a few calls of my own. The timing should be just about right. I arrived at the gym at 5 minutes to 7. The parking lot was overflowing, cars parked on the grass and down the access road. I had to park 3 blocks away. I walked toward the entrance, my laptop bag heavy on my shoulder. The air was thick with the smell of cheap popcorn, sweat, and fear. The gymnasium was packed. Every set of bleachers was full, people standing 3 deep along the walls. It was hot, suffocatingly so. As I walked in, a ripple of silence moved with me, followed by a wave of hisses and muttered curses. There she is. Witch. Look at her. Thinks she's better than us. I saw faces I'd known my whole life, loggers, secretaries, teachers, store owners, all staring at me with a uniform collective hatred. This was my town, and this was my execution. I ignored them, walked down the center aisle and took a single folding chair, set up in the front row. My family was already on the stage, my father grim and powerful, my mother pale and trembling but defiant at his side, and Liam, my brother, looking relaxed, almost bored, as if this were all just a tedious formality. At 7:05, my father strode to the podium. The gym erupted in applause. He held up a hand, a gesture he'd perfected over decades. He was the lion in winter, the patriarch protecting his flock. He gave the speech of his life. He talked about legacy, the word, a booming echo in the cavernous room. He talked about tradition, about the grandfather he had known, the one who built this town with his bare hands. He talked about community, about family, about how in hard times Rosewood sticks together, and then he turned his arm, outstretched his finger pointing directly at me. But we are under attack, he roared, his voice breaking with practiced outrage. An attack from within, from an ungrateful, venomous daughter who seeks to destroy what we have all built simply because of her own greed. She wants to take your jobs, your homes, your future to satisfy her own jealous spite. The crowd was on its feet, a single roaring animal. Shame, they yelled. Shame! They were screaming it at me, their faces red, their fingers pointing. My mother looked on, tears streaming down her face, a portrait of the wronged matriarch. Liam just smirked. I sat calmly, my hands resting on my laptop bag. I waited. When the noise finally died down, my father, breathing heavily, gestured to me with a dismissive wave. "The floor is yours, Scarlett, if you have anything to say for yourself." I stood. The boos were a physical force, a wall of sound that hit me as I walked the few steps to the stage and stood at the second podium. I waited, not looking at them, just letting the noise wash over me. It felt distant. When it quieted to a low, angry rumble, I tapped the microphone. The small thump echoed. "My father is right," I said. My voice was calm, clear, amplified. The gym went dead silent. They hadn't expected that. "This is about legacy. This is about the future of this town." I turned and looked at him. "But he's wrong about who's destroying it." Before he could interrupt, I unzipped my bag, pulled out my laptop, and placed it on the podium. I plugged the HDMI cable into the port for the projector screen hanging above the stage. "I'm not here to give a speech," I said, my voice carrying to the back row. "I'm here to give a presentation." I clicked the mouse. The projector flickered, and then a high-resolution satellite image filled the massive screen. It was the ghost cut. The raw, muddy wound in the heart of Bitterroot Creek. A collective audible gasp sucked the air from the room. "This," I said, "is my land. The land my grandfather left me to protect. And this is what your golden boy did to it." I clicked again. A new slide. Falsified harvest permits on mill letterhead next to the real sustainable thinning only contract. This wasn't thinning as I said. This was theft. Click. A new slide. A complex diagram of offshore bank accounts, wire transfers, dates. "And this is where the money went. He stole from me, he stole from this company, and he stole from you." Click. The name of the black market international timber buyer. Click. A list of known gambling clearinghouses in Macau and Costa Rica. He didn't risk his own money. He risked your money. He risked your jobs, your pensions, your town to pay for his gambling. I turned and pointed not at my father, but directly at my brother. He did this. Chaos. People were standing, yelling, pointing. My father was grabbing the mic, roaring, "Lies! These are forgeries!" Liam, his face white, his smirk gone, lunged for the stage. "Lies! She's lying, you bitch!" At that exact precise moment, the main double doors of the gymnasium slammed open. The noise of the crowd died in a wave from back to front. Two men in the blue and gray uniforms of the state police. Behind them, three other people, two men and a woman in dark suits that screamed federal. Investigators, from the Environmental Fraud Division, and by the look of them, the Treasury. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. They walked, their shoes echoing on the gymnasium floor, past the bleachers, past my father at the podium, and stopped directly in front of the stage, looking up at Liam. "Eleanor!" My mother shrieked, a raw animal sound of pure terror. She ran, stumbling, and threw herself in front of Liam, her arms spread wide. "No, you can't! He's my son! He's my boy! You can't take him!" Then she turned on me, her face a mask of such pure, venomous hatred. I almost flinched. "You!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "You did this! You called them! You monster! You've killed your father!" I took the microphone one last time. The gym was dead silent, the only sound my mother's ragged sobs. My voice, calm and steady, filled the void. "I didn't do this," I said, looking not at my mother but at the faces in the crowd. The faces that had called me traitor and witch. "I just turned on the lights. He's the criminal. And you." I looked at my father. "You all chose to protect him over the truth. A family that does that isn't a family, it's a conspiracy. And I'm done being a part of it." The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the room as the officers pulled Liam's hands behind his back. He was silent, his face white with shock. And as the cuffs snapped shut, my father, Arthur Edwards, his legacy, His name, his entire world disintegrating in front of the town he owned, made a low, gasping sound. He clutched his chest, his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed in a heap on the stage. People screamed. Paramedics were called. My mother wailed over Liam, ignoring her husband's body on the floor. I zipped up my laptop. I put the bag on my shoulder, walked off the stage, and went down the center aisle. No one met my eyes. No one said a word. I pushed open the heavy gym doors and walked out alone into the clean, cold night air. The detonation at the town hall was the end. What followed was the accounting. The mill didn't just stay closed, it was seized. With the federal charges against Liam and the mill as a corporate entity, combined with the irrefutable civil suit I had filed, Edwards Timber and Mill was placed into immediate receivership. The bank, desperate to distance itself from the fraud, forced the liquidation. The logging trucks, the saws, the heavy equipment, all of it went up for auction, sold for pennies on the dollar to pay the massive judgment from my lawsuit. The Edwards Timber and Mill sign that had greeted everyone entering Rosewood was taken down, leaving 2 blank wooden posts on the side of the highway. The family lodge, the stone and timber fortress where I had been cast out, was the last asset to go. It, too, was plastered with auction notices. My father, I learned through town gossip, had survived the heart attack. He'd spent 2 weeks in the ICU in Portland before being released. But the man who came back wasn't Arthur Edwards. He was a ghost. Broken. The booming voice that had dictated the fortunes of this town was gone, replaced by the shuffling silence of a man in a rented condo on the outskirts of town, a place he and my mother had been forced to move into when the bank seized their home. The day before the auction, I used the old key I still had to let myself into the lodge. The power was off, and the cavernous great room was cold and dark, smelling of dust and stale ashes. All the furniture was gone, replaced by small white auction tags taped to the walls and fixtures. This was the victory I had fought for. This was the win. And it felt heavy, hollow. I had never wanted this. I had never wanted to destroy them. I had only wanted to stop the bleeding, and they had refused to let me. They had forced my hand, and this emptiness was the consequence. I hadn't destroyed them. They had self-destructed, and I was just the one who had refused to be dragged down with them. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing on the bare wood floors. In my old bedroom, I found one thing the auctioneers had missed. Tucked into the back of the closet on the floor was a small warped cardboard box. Inside was a handful of childhood photos. I picked one up. It was me, maybe 10 years old, sitting on my grandfather's lap, on the porch of his small cabin. We were both grinning, holding up a stringer of trout. "You're the smart one, Scarlett," he'd told me once, his voice a low rumble. "Don't ever let them mistake your smarts for weakness." I clutched the faded photograph, the cardboard soft at the edges. "I didn't," I whispered to the empty, silent room. "I did the right thing." The hollowness didn't disappear, but a steel rod of certainty firmed up inside it. This was the cost of freedom. This was the price of the truth. The town, as I'd expected, was hurting. But the narrative, the one my father had so carefully controlled, had shattered. The anger was no longer directed at me. The gym presentation with its cold, hard data had been undeniable. The anger was now directed at the memory of my father's pride and the reality of my brother's greed. They weren't mad at the woman who had exposed the rot. They were mad at the rot itself. And as I had promised, I began the real work. The money from the lawsuit, the millions I'd won from the liquidation, was deposited not into my bank account, but into the newly chartered Rosewood Economic and Environmental Trust. I was its director. I kept my small, gold-leafed office on Main Street, but now it was the center of the town's rebirth. I didn't just build a new entity. I got into the trenches. I held workshops for the laid-off loggers, using my grant-writing skills to help them apply for federal retraining funds. I set up a micro-loan incubator, funding a former mill secretary's dream of opening a bakery and helping 2 former shift supervisors start their own sustainable forestry consulting firm. I was no longer the destroyer. I was the rebuilder. I was using the very soft skills my father had mocked to give this town a future one that wasn't dependent on a single corruptible industry. One rainy afternoon, about 2 months after the town hall, my office door opened. It was Chloe. I hadn't seen her since that night on the logging road. Her divorce from Liam, who was awaiting a federal trial, was finalized. She looked thin, but her eyes were clear. I wanted to thank you," she said, twisting the strap of her purse. "You were the only one who believed me. You saved me." "You saved yourself, Chloe," I said, getting up from my desk. "You were the one who had the courage to speak up." I made us coffee and we sat for an hour, two women talking quietly as the rain streamed down the plate glass window. It was the first normal human conversation I'd had in months. It was a small thing, but it felt huge. It was a connection, a piece of solid ground. I was at a public planning meeting a week later presenting the initial blueprints for the new community center, the one that would be built on the reclaimed land where the mill's lumberyard used to be. My phone, which I'd set to vibrate, buzzed on the table. I glanced down. An unknown number. I ignored it and continued my presentation. The phone buzzed again and again, relentlessly. I excused myself, stepped into the hallway, and answered it, a knot of irritation tightening in my stomach. "What?" "Scarlett." The voice was thin, reedy, almost unrecognizable, but I knew it. It was my mother. "Don't hang up, please." I said nothing, my knuckles white on the phone. It's your father. He's not well, Scarlett. He's asking for you." I still said nothing. Her voice dropped to a desperate, hissing whisper. "He says he needs to tell you something about your grandfather." I stood in the hallway of the community center, the phone pressed to my ear long after the line went dead. "Something about your grandfather." It was the perfect bait, a final, desperate manipulation, or the one last broken piece of truth. All my life I had been maneuvered by my family's needs, their demands, their guilt. This felt like the last test. Was I going still as a daughter, hoping for a deathbed apology? Or was I going as an adult, a separate entity, simply to close a final door? I knew as I got into my truck that I had to go. Not for them, for me. I had to see the end of the story. The address she'd given me was a cheap 2-story condo complex on the other side of the highway, the kind with thin walls and outdoor staircases. It smelled like wet pavement and mildew. I found their unit 2B and knocked. The woman who opened the door was my mother, but she was a stranger. The polished family unity mask was gone, replaced by a permanent, weary bitterness. Her expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a worn-out sweater. She didn't invite me in. She just stood in the doorway, blocking it. "Look what you did!" she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. The hatred I'd seen in the gym had settled in her eyes, hard and cold. "I hope you're happy. Look at him." She stepped aside, revealing the cramped, dim living room. The air was stale, smelling of old food and sickness. There in the corner, dwarfed by a rented hospital-grade wheelchair, sat my father. He wasn't just smaller, he was shrunken. The Lion of Rosewood was gone, replaced by a frail, sallow man with a plaid blanket over his knees. His eyes, when they found mine, were watery and dull. "You broke him," my mother's voice drilled into my ear. "You broke this entire family. All of it. All this. Just for your pride. If you just kept quiet, if you just let your father and brother handle it, if you'd been a good daughter." "Eleanor, enough." The voice from the wheelchair was a dry rasp, a handful of gravel. It had no power, but it had a final, terrible weight. My mother snapped her mouth shut, her eyes flashing with a new betrayal. I stepped past her into the room and stood a few feet from his chair. He stared at me, his breathing shallow. She's right. You know. He wheezed, a faint rattling cough shaking his small frame. I prepared myself for the final blow, the last curse. You broke us. You took the mill. You put your brother in a cage. You destroyed everything. I said nothing. I just waited. His eyes, filmed over, seemed to look past me at the wall, at the 30 years of his own blindness. And you were right to do it. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. I felt my own heart stop. I was a fool, he whispered the words, costing him. A proud, blind fool. I always saw Liam's. I saw what I wanted to see. I chose the wrong child. He fumbled with the blanket, his hand spotted, and trembling, emerging with a small, old-fashioned brass key. It was a safe deposit box key. This was your grandfather's, he said, his voice straining. He gave it to me just before he died. He said, give this to Scarlett, but not until you're gone, or not until she's strong enough to know what to do with it. He held the key out to me, his hand shaking so violently I had to take it from his open palm. I'm not strong, he whispered. You are. I should have chosen you. All along. He began to weep. Not the loud, angry sobs of a patriarch, but the silent, weeping tears of a broken, dying old man. I looked at the key in my hand. I looked at my mother, her face a mask of absolute, stunned horror. This was her final, ultimate betrayal, her husband admitting at the end that her entire life's work of propping up the golden boy had been a waste. And I looked at my father weeping for his own mistakes. I felt nothing. Not triumph, not pity, not even the satisfaction of vindication. This wasn't a victory, it was just an ending. The last sad, pathetic scene. Thank you. I said, my voice quiet but firm. I closed my hand around the key. I looked at both of them, two ghosts in a stale room. I'm not here as your daughter. I'm not here for an apology. I'm not here for this. I held up the key. I'm just here to say goodbye. I turned. Scarlett. My mother's voice was a desperate choking sound, but I didn't stop. I walked out of the condo. I didn't run. I walked. I heard the door click shut behind me. My mother didn't follow. As I walked down the metal staircase into the cool, gray afternoon, I felt it. The last heavy, guilty tether that had bound me to them for 29 years. It didn't just break, it dissolved. It evaporated into the air. I was free. The catharsis wasn't a shout. It was a quiet, deep, cleansing breath. The bank, the new one that had replaced the failed rosewood branch, was still open. I walked in my muddy boots, echoing on the marble floor. I still had my ID, my birth certificate. I could prove who I was. The bank manager, a new woman from Portland, was respectful. Ms. Edwards, how can we help? I need to access a safe deposit box, I said, placing the brass key on the counter. It took 20 minutes, but she finally led me into the vault. She unlocked her side, then stepped away. I inserted the old key. The tumblers clicked. I pulled open the long metal box. It was almost empty. No cash, no bonds. Just a single thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with wax. On the front, in my grandfather's familiar, strong black script, was my name. Scarlett. I broke the seal. Inside was a letter. The paper heavy, the ink faded but clear, dated 15 years ago. I unfolded it. It began, My dearest Scarlett, if you are reading this, it means the mill is in trouble and Arthur has failed. I prayed it would not come to this, but I knew you wouldn't. 1 year later, the air in Bitterroot Creek smelled of damp earth and pine sap. I stood on a newly built wooden boardwalk, the sound of a woodpecker echoing from the trees. And if you look here, I said, pointing to a patch of vibrant green that's fireweed. It's one of the first plants to return after a disruption. It's a healer. It lays the groundwork for everything else that comes after. The group of high school students, part of the new Rosewood Environmental Studies program, scribbled in their notebooks. I was guiding them along the Bitterroot Creek interpretive trail. The ghost cut, the massive muddy scar that had torn my world apart, was still visible. You couldn't erase a wound that deep in just a year. But it was no longer a graveyard, it was a nursery. Thousands of fir and cedar saplings planted by the trust and community volunteers pushed up through the soil. The land was healing. And so was the town. Back in my office that afternoon, I unlocked my desk drawer and pulled out the letter. My grandfather's letter. I'd read it 100 times, its creases soft as old cloth. "My dearest Scarlett," it said. "If you are reading this, it means the mill is in trouble and Arthur has failed. I prayed it would not come to this. But I knew you wouldn't." That last line had hit me like a physical blow in the bank vault. He knew, he had always known. I read the rest, the lines I now knew by heart. "Your father is a good man in his way, but he is blinded by pride. He thinks a legacy is something you build with brute force. He doesn't understand that a real legacy is something you grow. And Liam, your brother, is a broken link, Scarlett. He has a hunger that can't be filled, and he will devour everything to try and fill it. Your father's love for him will be the mill's undoing." The letter had laid it all out. He'd told me that the mill as it stood was a dinosaur. It was built for a world that was vanishing. It couldn't and shouldn't survive. "Arthur will never see this," he'd written. "He will hold on until it pulls him and the whole town under. You must be the one to let it go. You are the smart one. You see the systems." The box hadn't just contained the letter. Tucked beneath it were bearer bonds, a small hidden fortune. Not enough to save the mill, but as his letter explained, seed money. Seed money for a different kind of future. He'd included a detailed plan notes scribbled on engineering paper for how to diversify the town's economy, how to leverage its natural beauty for sustainable tourism, how to retrain a timber workforce for high-tech carpentry and artisan trades. He hadn't left me a weapon. He had left me a blueprint. And I had followed it. As the head of the Rosewood Trust, I had used that seed money and the millions from the lawsuit to make his vision a reality. The town was coming back, but it was coming back different. The old mill, or what was left of it, hadn't been bulldozed. It was being repurposed. The massive central building was now the Rosewood Hub, a shared space for local artisans. A furniture maker, who once ran a planer at the mill, now sold handcrafted tables for thousands of dollars. A tech startup funded by one of our incubator grants was designing logistics software in the old HR offices. The bakery Chloe had opened, she had come back after all, was thriving. We were no longer a company town. We were just a town, a community. My life had changed too. I'd sold my small apartment and had used my own money to buy my grandfather's old cabin, the small one overlooking the creek. I'd spent the year fixing it up. It was quiet. It was mine. I wasn't alone there. Mark, a high school biology teacher who had volunteered on the trail building crew, was coming over for dinner. He was kind and steady, and when he looked at me, I knew he saw me, Scarlett, not an Edwards. He saw my work, my soft skills, and he thought they were, in his words, badass. The mail was on my desk, bills, proposals, and a single flimsy envelope. The return address was a federal corrections facility. My brother's name was printed in shaky block letters. I held it for a moment. I knew what would be inside. Excuses, blame, self-pity. A rambling plea for money or help or a sister he had never truly had. A year ago, this letter would have torn me apart. It would have dredged up a lifetime of guilt of feeling responsible for the broken link. I walked over to the small wood stove I kept in the office for cold mornings. I struck a match, lit the corner of the envelope, and dropped it inside. I didn't need to read it. I didn't need his apology or his anger. I just needed him to be gone. I watched the paper curl, the ink of his name turning to black ash before disappearing entirely. I was finished. The last tether was burned. As I watched the smoke rise, I thought of that final cold text from my mother. "We're done." She had meant it as a curse, an exile. But she had been right. We were done. Done with the lies, the pride, the betrayals, the crushing weight of a legacy I had never asked for. I looked out my window at Main Street. The lights were on in the bakery. The marquee of the newly restored theater, the project I'd secured the grant for what felt like a lifetime ago, was glowing, advertising a community movie night. I had not just survived them. I had built something better in their place. My legacy wasn't blood. It wasn't timber. It was this. It was the healed land, the new growth, the quiet resilience of a town and a woman rebuilding itself from the ground up. By letting go of the family that tried to destroy her, Scarlett finally built a legacy that was truly her own. What did you think of her decision to dismantle everything? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We truly read every single one. Subscribe for more stories of justice and new beginnings. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.